Hello and welcome to FFRF's Ask An Atheist. I'm Liz Cavell, Deputy Legal Director at the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
And I'm Chris Line, Rapid Legal Counsel at FFRF.
This week, we're going to be talking about some very alarming ways that the Johnson Amendment is being eroded. That is the law which, on paper, prevents churches and nonprofits like us from endorsing political candidates for office. Without it, churches would be free to serve as tools for the government and create super PACs with anonymous donors.
Yeah, so recently the IRS decided to stop enforcing the Johnson Amendment, not that they enforced it much before, and the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, recently published an op-ed calling for more church involvement in politics. We're going to talk about what he gets wrong about the First Amendment and why the Johnson Amendment is so important.
All right, let's get into it.
Yeah.
So the Johnson Amendment is sort of an obscure name for a very simple thing, which is a statute that regulates 501c3 organizations, which includes churches and groups like ours, the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And it's basically a rule that says charitable donations should go to charitable purposes. So tax-exempt organizations cannot do one thing, and it is endorse political candidates for office, meaning during elections, they can't weigh in on or use their official channels of their organization to oppose or endorse a specific candidate for office.
Right. The purpose of that amendment was to preserve the integrity and the nonpartisan nature of charitable and religious organizations, ensuring that our tax-deductible donations don't subsidize political campaigning. So you can't get a tax break when you donate to a campaign, and so you can't get a tax break if you're donating to a church or a nonprofit that's going to use that money to fund a campaign or to endorse a candidate.
Exactly. It's a restriction that comes in exchange for tax-exempt status, right? It is not a free speech violation or a censorship. It is just one of the many regulations that a 501c3 has to abide by in order to enjoy the privilege of tax-exempt status. So let's talk about why it's not a violation of the free speech clause, or why the Johnson Amendment has never been controversial in terms of its constitutionality. Like I said, it is just a condition for tax exemption, which is a privilege, not a right, that organizations and churches get to enjoy, meaning people can make donations and they can write them off on their taxes. They're tax-free dollars. We don't allow churches and 501c3s to endorse candidates because otherwise 501c3s basically are just black hole PACs. Right. Because, why would you donate to campaigns when you could just create a 501c3 and everyone could give tax deductible donations to what are basically would become PACs?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of misinformation with this, with churches trying to spin it the other way around and say, so the fact that they're a 501c3 automatically is a huge privilege. So like if you want to start a nonprofit like FFRF, you need to do this onerous process to become a 501c3 if you're not a church. Churches get it automatically, but they've been spinning that and pretending that that's a bad thing. For example, in the lawsuit where they were suing over the Johnson Amendment and applying, they say, well, we churches are forced to be 501c3s, and then you put these restrictions on us about what we can do in terms of campaigning, trying to spin that privilege into a downside. The reality is they don't have to take it. You could start a church and then decide and tell the IRS, we don't want to be a 501c3, we don't want to be have that nonprofit status, we'd like to be taxed, and in exchange, we're going to go ahead and do all the politicking we want. That's totally a permissible thing, but they want to have it both ways and say, no, we definitely need to still have that tax exemption. That's super important to us, but we also don't want the reasonable restrictions that are applied to everybody who gets that tax exempt status.
Right. As usual, they want special status under the law. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They don't want to pay taxes, obviously. They want to remain tax exempt, but they don't want to do it within a system of civil laws and regulations. They just want to do it and also conduct themselves in whatever way they want without any interference whatsoever.
Right, and conduct's the important thing there. This is not regulating speech. They're free to talk about these issues. There's so many ways that churches can get their point across about what they believe and speak to their congregants and things without actually endorsing specifically a candidate for election. Like this really hasn't been a burden at all. Like any church could easily still talk about what they think is important in regard to politics to their congregation without violating this rule.
I know. That's something that's so important when we talk about this issue. It's like the biggest piece of misinformation that I think is spun by these, uber conservative political church actors that want to politic, is that the rules are already so permissive, and there's so much that groups like ours and churches can speak out on that affects political decision making. And even during elections, the Johnson Amendment is such a narrow restriction, and it's talked about as like, tying churches' hands behind their back. They're totally muzzled. They're censored. They can't speak, their religious values in a political framework to their congregants, and it's just total nonsense. Like, the only thing the Johnson Amendment restricts is endorsing or opposing candidates for office. So saying, vote for X or don't vote for Y. But what groups like ours and churches can do is expansive. They can talk about issues. So in other words, they could talk about their church's position on abortion. They could talk about their church's position on all manner of political issues, even less cultural, more political issues like voting rights or, something more political. But they can't endorse named candidates. And they're supposed to abide by both the letter and the spirit of that rule. But there is a lot of, sort of like religion-based values expression that they can do to their congregants, and even in a way that like informs their voting behavior. Like, this is not an onerous restriction. It is, yes, it requires like meticulous kind of like rule following and, managing communications at your organization, but it is in no way like a restriction that muzzles your ability to like speak your values and your mission to your followers. It is really not that hard to abide by.
And then on top of that, we can shift gears
enforced.
a little bit to the fact, right, that it's not enforced, to the point where FFRF, we actually had to sue the IRS in 2012 to compel it to enforce it. And that lawsuit was resolved with basically them saying, we're going to try to put some things in place to try to make sure we're doing a little bit more to enforce these rules that, as you said, are not even that onerous on churches anyway.
Right. It's always been under enforced. So there's also not even a real world there's no real world support for the idea that churches are actually losing their tax exempt status left and right because they're speaking out on candidates or, engaging in political speech. What's odd about the recent sort of news from the IRS that they're making this statement they're not going to enforce the Johnson Amendment is that it's coming to us through a lawsuit consent decree, which is basically the IRS has been sued by the Christian Broadcasters Network, basically saying you're violating our First Amendment rights with the Johnson Amendment. And now that they have an administration that is friendly to that point of view, they have reached a settlement in the lawsuit. And basically the document that sets forth the terms of that settlement is called a consent decree. And in the consent decree is where the IRS says, we don't view the Johnson Amendment as restricting churches' ability to endorse candidates. And so that is clearly just a departure from the plain language of the Johnson Amendment, which is a duly passed law of Congress. And so it kind of remains to be seen what the implications of that will be if the court in that case adopts this consent decree, which hasn't quite happened yet.
And it's important to note this interpretation is coming 70 years after the Johnson Amendment was written, and now suddenly the IRS has determined that, it turns out for the past 70 years, this is what it meant, that you actually could have been endorsing candidates in the pulpit. This whole time we didn't tell you, we didn't properly explain what this means. So kind of crazy.
So that's what kind of has this in the news, right? The IRS just this past week has agreed to this consent decree. So that's what got, I think, the Speaker of the House feeling the need to speak publicly with his op-ed about the Johnson Amendment and, you know, how the current administration and the IRS is viewing the Johnson Amendment and how it restricts churches. So let's talk about the op-ed.
Yeah, so Mike Johnson wrote an op-ed on X. I didn't know that X had.
As one does.
I didn't know that it was a platform where you can put op-eds on, but it's the first one I've ever seen.
I mean, isn't it all just one giant op-ed?
Right, but this is not like a tweet. This is like an official, it's like a different type of thing than a tweet. They apparently have op-eds now. So Mike Johnson posted this op-ed about the Johnson Amendment. FFRF, we put a press release out criticizing his recent op-ed. In the op-ed, he praises the IRS proposed consent decree that paves the way for churches to endorse political candidates while maintaining their tax-exempt status.
Yeah, so we all know the Speaker of the House loves a government action that privileges Christians especially, and, you know, ultra-conservative religionists more so. But I think he basically buys into all of the misinformation that we just kind of laid out on sort of the history of the Johnson Amendment and also how it actually affects churches. There's nothing special about what churches are restricted from doing as compared to other 501c3s, which is what is one of the huge problems with the IRS's position in this consent decree, which apparently only applies to churches, and how this restriction would be enforced or not enforced against churches. We're all similarly situated organizations who have to abide by the same rules.
In his op-ed, Mike Johnson says, on Monday, the IRS agreed to a consent judgment that will restore the First Amendment rights of churches and religious nonprofit organizations to speak freely without losing their tax-exempt status. As a former constitutional law litigator, I, along with many of my former colleagues, have long argued that the Johnson Amendment is unconstitutional.
I don't know if what Mike Johnson is getting at there is that the Johnson Amendment is unconstitutional as applied to all 501c3s, but I suspect not. I suspect what he's saying is just churches are entitled to special constitutional protection, because not only is it speech, but it's their religiously motivated speech that double counts. But the reality is, it's a minor restriction on what churches can and can't do. It doesn't restrict the individual speech of pastors. It doesn't restrict their ability to speak about political issues. It only involves endorsements and oppositions to candidates for office.
Right, and more importantly, it's only around speech and the sort of conduct related to that.
Yes.
This isn't any sort of you can't do this sort of religious practice as part of your thing. It's just talking about what you're saying, the messaging, the particular type of messaging you're doing, which means the religious argument is just that we get to say certain religious messages specially, but that religious message is about endorsing a candidate.
Right.
So you can see right there,
well, if I'm saying vote for XYZ because of my religion, it's extra protected.
That's true. I guess, so the way it would work, that the religious speech would matter is if you're saying, God says vote for this person, now you're interpreting your religious beliefs through this, and that would be a religious violation.
That really is the argument. It's that there's something special about saying vote for X person if you're saying it's, commanded from on high. Whereas if we at FFRF or some other 501c3 said vote for X person, there's no reason the government couldn't restrict that, because our speech is not doubly protected.
Right. So he goes on. Most people today who insist upon a rigid separation between church and state are unaware the phrase derives not from the Constitution, but from a personal letter that President Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association in 1802. Jefferson clearly did not mean that metaphorical wall was to keep religion from influencing issues of civil government. To the contrary, it was meant to keep the federal government from impeding the religious practices of citizens. The founders wanted to protect the church from an encroaching state, not the other way around.
This is such propaganda, and I'm sick of it. And coming from, such a high office as the Speaker of the House, it's shameful. This has gained such traction in Christian national political ideological circles. It is flat out not true. I noticed there's no citations in the X op-ed, but you'll just have to take Mike Johnson's word for it that the founders had no intention of church-state separation being a two-way street. It was actually meant to be a one-way street, only protecting the church from the encroachment of the state, but not in any way prohibiting the state from taking on a totally theocratic character.
Yeah, so he's a constitutional law litigator who has no idea about how this constitutional law has worked. But I think more importantly, just from a reasonable point of view, he's basically saying that Thomas Jefferson was an idiot. Because why would Jefferson refer to it as a wall between separation of church and state, knowing that it can pass through one way and not the other? That's not how a wall works, and I trust that Thomas Jefferson understood that. I didn't meet him, obviously. It was written a long time ago. He seemed pretty smart, though, and I'll bet he understood that a wall means things don't go either direction.
Yeah, I think that's pretty clear. Pretty cut and dry. And also, we could just look to all of the other many writings of the founders, including the Virginia religious freedom statutes that explicitly talk about state-church separation as a mutual obligation, and the purpose of it being having a government that is secular in character was obviously intended by our founders. You have to work really hard to ignore the founding era sort of constitutional debates around secular government. And you have to read a lot into our constitutional documents in order to find otherwise. It is a totally self-serving piece of revisionist history.
And that's exactly what he does. As he goes on, a free society and a healthy republic depend upon religious and moral virtue, not only because they help prevent political corruption and the abuse of power, but also because those convictions in the minds and hearts of the people make it possible to preserve their essential freedoms by emphasizing and inspiring individual responsibility, self-sacrifice, the dignity of hard work, the rule of law, civility, patriotism, the value of family and community, and the sanctity of every human life.
He said unironically. Please, Mike Johnson, tell me more about preventing political corruption and the abuse of power.
We've not seen religious leaders. You don't ever really hear about religious leaders abusing power, abusing their positions. They never get in trouble. They never do anything wrong. They're just this moral light for all of us to follow.
Somehow that depends on religious virtue? Why? That is not something that our founders in any way had any sort of consensus on. They specifically chose to create founding documents that very noticeably left out all references to religiosity of the people that would fill positions in the civil government. It's very obvious that there is no religious requirement built into our constitutional order. So we'll just call that Mike Johnson's opinion.
Yeah, he's going to directly refute you. He goes on to say,
no.
Anyone who has been misled to believe that religious principles and viewpoints must be separate from public affairs should be reminded to review their history. Let us hope the federal court in Texas accepts the IRS consent judgment as yet another acknowledgement of these essential truths.
I do not know what separated from public affairs means, but that's really tricky language because nobody is saying that religious principles and viewpoints must be separated from public affairs. That's not what we're talking about. Yep. I read that to mean American pluralism, the public space, the public discourse, all that is good and well. We're talking about American government. And yes, religious principles and viewpoints were meant to be separated from American government. And our laws and our Constitution, our rights, our civil rights and laws were meant to be separate from religious viewpoints and principles. And that is definitely our history.
Right, and our politicians are free to be sort of guided by sort of their religious beliefs and principles and things like that, but they're not supposed to take those explicit viewpoints and put them into law or push them onto anyone else or use the government to enforce their religious beliefs throughout the country.
I know, Chris. I just get very annoyed at this. It is a very deliberate and slimy way of portraying what a secular advocate is working for, to say, like, we want to drive religion from the public square, or we want to separate religion from all public life. They know that that's not what they're fighting for. They're fighting for religion to occupy government.
Right.
Religion to take over and completely infuse our laws and rights.
Right, so they act like, oh, FFRF doesn't want 10 Commandments anywhere or something like that. But you can look at our most recent victory this week, where we had a 10 Commandments removed from an Illinois courthouse lawn, and it's now been moved to a church.
Yeah, right totally down the way.
And guess what? We're not still trying to get that 10 Commandments removed from the church, because we don't care what you do as a part of your public. I mean, that's out in public.
Yes.
It cannot be on the government's property. The government cannot be pushing religion. People in the public, in the same way that I can talk about my atheistic beliefs, religious people are free to talk about their religious beliefs outside of the government. I could not, become mayor and then start saying Madison is a atheist city now, and put atheism or push my beliefs onto everyone through that. Not that it's the same as religious beliefs, but you get the idea.
I get the idea. Well, thank you for that really important lesson on revisionist American history, Mike Johnson. But back to the Johnson Amendment itself, like you said, it's been in place on the books for 70 years. And what's really important is that at the time it was adopted through to now, it has always been actually quite popular, bipartisan up until recently, supported by bipartisan majorities in Congress when it was passed. And also polling shows that the American people, including religious congregants, actually don't want politicking and candidate endorsements from their churches and charities. Like, the people understand that charitable donations should go to charitable purposes. That makes sense, and the public supports this.
Yeah, in 2022, Pew Research found that about 3/4 of U.S. adults, 77%, say that churches and other houses of worship should not endorse candidates for political office. 2/3, 67%, say religious institutions should keep out of political matters rather than expressing their views on day-to-day social or political questions. So
that's not even prohibited by the Johnson Amendment.
Right, and
that's second one.
That's a majority. I mean, that's not like this is a 51-49 issue where we do just slightly. No, this is overwhelming, and like you said, a lot of those people are religious, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. Churches don't want to have to get involved in politics. Like a lot of churches are like, hey, we'd actually like to form a community here in our city. We'd like to have people from all across the political spectrum come to our church. We don't want to be a Republican church, a Democratic church. We don't want to only adhere to a certain political view. And this has helped them avoid that, because it gives them an excuse too to be like, we're actually not even allowed to address this, so even if we wanted to, we can't. So I guess you're just gonna have to come and we'll just talk about our religion and keep it related to theology, and we won't just talk about the politics of the day as our main priority.
Yeah, I think that points out something that's like important about this whole debate, is that it really is, like with so many things in culture and politics, it really is this minority, this outsized minority of the most conservative and the most political churches that want to eviscerate, do away with, destroy the Johnson Amendment. It's not all churches by any means, and it's certainly not people who attend church, like the congregants of churches. If in 2002, 77% of US adults are saying churches shouldn't endorse candidates for office, that number includes many religious identifying Americans, and some of whom do actually attend church.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be the extremists who are trying to fuse politics and religion for political purposes. So like Tony Perkins, his response to this, and he's been an advocate of getting rid of the Johnson Amendment, was, now churches are free, the leash is gone. Similarly, Matt Staver at Liberty Counsel, a Christian ministry, said the Trump administration has now agreed to unshackle the pulpit from the chains of the Johnson Amendment. Important to note, Tony Perkins' outfit, the Family Research Council, which treats itself as like a church now. It's that's how it files with the IRS, has about 18,000 pastors in its network and is vetting additional lists of evangelical pastors to contact in hopes of letting them know now that they're free to speak on the issue. So they're actively going to churches and saying, all right, guys, it's time to mobilize. Like, we're a political outfit now.
Yeah.
Let's get going.
Again, already free to speak on the issues. Johnson Amendment does not in any way prohibit churches from speaking on the issues.
Right.
This is now, all right, guys, now we can go out and endorse specific candidates for office. In other words, we can act like a PAC, where our sole purpose is to get people elected to specific offices, even though we are a charity collecting tax-exempt charitable donations.
Yeah, I mean, on the bright side, we've seen some religious groups pushing back. Joint Baptist
Joint Committee.
Baptist Joint Committee, who's always stood for separation of church and state, of course, is on the right side of this and doesn't want the Johnson Amendment. But even the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops said the IRS was addressing a specific case, and it doesn't change how the Catholic Church engages in public debate. The Church seeks to help Catholics form their conscience in the gospel so they might discern which candidates and policies would advance the common good. The Catholic Church maintains its stance of not endorsing or opposing political candidates. So it's a pretty
That's
major...
actually a very honest and accurate encapsulation of what the Johnson Amendment prohibits. Like, there's nothing restricting Catholic priests or any other religious pastor or preacher from helping their congregants form their conscience in the gospel so they might discern which candidates to vote for. In other words, preaching from the pulpit and anywhere else about issues like cultural and political that would form your political opinions and affect your voting behavior. We're just talking about endorsements and opposition for candidates, and that's what the Catholic Church, I think, laudably is saying, yeah, we're going to continue to not do that.
Yep.
They're also striking something that's also important in that statement, which is this is coming through a consent decree, don't forget. Like, it remains to be seen. You know, Mike Johnson is lauding this as like the Trump administration finally, you know, does away with this statute that has long violated our rights. But the reality is a consent decree is a settlement that applies to the parties in the case. Yes, it's an expression of the IRS's policy, I guess, going forward, but it doesn't quite do all of the things, it doesn't have the force of law that it's being sort of proclaimed as by the Christian nationalist right.
Right. So from a legal standpoint, it actually only applies to these two churches, the churches and the organizations involved. Those are the only people who could say, if the IRS took action, nope, you are legally prohibited from doing this. But on top of that, if you look into the consent decree, the current consent decree limits a church's permissible political activity to bona fide communications internal to a house of worship between the house of worship and its congregation in connection with religious services through its usual channels of communications on matters of faith. Which is a whole bunch of words in there that make it a little bit muddy about what does that even mean. It seems pretty clear that under their understanding, if you're giving a Sunday sermon and you're speaking to your congregation, that is going to be,
suggests that it's talking about the pulpit.
Right.
Sermons.
So there's a lot of arguing that can be made. So then what happens when, that sermon is posted online for millions more people? Or, practically, I mean, that's of the issues that FFRF has taken up that we've complained about. We see them because someone was able to view a video of the sermon, and that's how we learn. We're not getting calls from people being like, hey, I was in my church sermon this Sunday, and this is what the pastor said. Like, the only reason we even find out about it is that it gets out there. So in theory, this could be correct in that if these sermons were actually just for the congregants and not these massive platforms of getting messaging and information out, you wouldn't even know, we wouldn't know, nobody would even know. There'd be nobody to inform the IRS because nobody would know these things are happening.
But we do also get reports all the time of churches endorsing candidates or opposing candidates through other channels that are official to their organization. For example, in church bulletins, in big glossy brochures that are funded and put out by the church or the religious organization. There's nothing in the consent decree that seems like it would protect any of that type of activity But again, it remains to be seen. Obviously, it's being given a very expansive interpretation by all of its fans.
I think certainly I feel very confident saying that the thing that was actually prosecuted, the thing that we actually have a case on a church being taken to court for violating the Johnson Amendment, was on specifically buying political ads. So I don't think even under this IRS that they would support that. So like if a church is actually spending funds to put up political ads, I think even under this extremely permissive IRS, that would at least still be illegal, and that's like clearly prohibited by the previous case.
Well, let's talk about the Congressional Free Thought Caucus's reaction to the IRS consent decree.
Yeah, so members of the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, they actually sent a letter to the IRS blasting its proposed settlement in the lawsuit that threatens to gut the Johnson Amendment. That letter warns that it could let churches become unregulated, tax-exempt super PACs with no transparency, no accountability, and no limits. Which of course is a recipe for dark money and theocratic influence in our elections, which we've been talking about. But the Free Thought Caucus is also just demanding answers from the IRS and urging it to withdraw this deeply flawed settlement.
And I think it's important too, coming from, again, a congressional caucus,
right,
because again, the Johnson Amendment was a duly passed law of Congress, act of Congress. And so why or how the IRS could just change the like plain meaning of the law, a law passed by Congress, but we're still waiting to find out where that authority comes from. And I think Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House of Representatives, who's very concerned about the abuse of power and political corruption, might want to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to back in 2017 when Trump declared the Johnson Amendment was no more, and FFRF actually sued, and then Trump's lawyers in court said, actually, yeah, he can't get rid of he can't get rid of a law just by declaring it. That was how that case was
that
resolved.
lawsuit ended with an admission by the then Justice Department that actually that executive order did nothing to change the Johnson Amendment.
And so it's the same thing here. This interpretation by the IRS does not actually get rid of the Johnson Amendment. It's just a very clear signal that this IRS is not going to be pursuing it, particularly in the specific way that we mentioned. We're obviously going to watch out for the things we talked about, the really egregious stuff, and we're still going to be making complaints to the IRS and making all that information known to everyone so that we can expose what's going on here and keep harping on why this is so important and try to make sure that our government does in some ways enforce this and that we don't just see all these super terrifying outcomes we're afraid of here with that money being funneled into politics. Because I don't think we necessarily covered it in this talk. We've talked about it before, but churches don't have to fill out Form 990. So like FFRF as a nonprofit, we have to basically tell you where our money comes from, where it goes. Churches don't have to do that. So theoretically, if you had a church that was endorsing candidates and being super involved in politics in that way, you could give them an unlimited amount of money. You don't have to report that. They're not going to tell anyone that you're giving them that money. And that money can then flow to candidates to help them get people elected.
Unlike political contributions and laws governing campaign finance, the 501c3 laws governing churches already make them sort of financial black holes.
Yeah.
So add that to the ability to campaign and interfere in elections on behalf of candidates, and you have like just nightmare black hole campaign finance situation.
Yep. So, clearly, as I stated, like the IRS under this Trump administration is not going to be enforcing the provision. It is important to remember, like we said, the law is still in the books. There's always a possibility of future accountability. So that's something churches need to watch out for, that they just start doing this, and then someday the IRS is not under this permissive view, the administration that is trying to push religion into everything, and then they could then get in trouble. Like, hey, for the last 10 years, you've been violating the Johnson Amendment, which is still a law, and we're going to take action on you now. So they definitely shouldn't feel comfortable doing that. And of course, FFRF, as a tax-exempt organization, we're going to keep working to hold these people accountable, and we're also exploring all possible legal avenues to what we might be able to do in the situation. Some things you alluded to, that there is some disparity between us as a 501c3 and churches, and the fact that churches now get to do this. We don't. These are the sort of things that we're exploring and trying to figure out, like, what action we might be able to take to.
Right. Certainly the government, if it's going to go forward and enforce this prohibition, the Johnson Amendment, only against 501c3s that are not religious, but not enforce that same law on the books against religious organizations, then they're violating our secular organizations' right to free exercise, or to equal protection under the law, which is also a constitutional right. So, I mean, they're certainly like opening up a box that doesn't necessarily, prevent them from having, the government from having other constitutional claims raised by the whole world of other organizations that abide by the Johnson Amendment in exchange for tax-exempt status.
Yeah, and one last thing I think is good to note here as we wrap this up. This has not been accepted by the judge yet.
True.
So on top of that, this is not even the rules even under this narrow situation yet. But also another group, our friends Americans United have for separation of church and state, have actually filed to intervene in the case, and that will have to be dealt with before the judge can rule on this. And so we're probably going to see quite a bit more going on in this case before even this thing that we don't like would become the rule, or at least the policy going forward.
Right. And again, that whole Mike Johnson op-ed just speaks to the fact that, like, I think they realize the Johnson Amendment is popular. Their position is, gross political, opportunism, and most people don't want to see charitable donations going to black hole PACs. And so, this is like a little revisionist history PR tour for why we should all be fine with the government not enforcing the Johnson Amendment and just opening up churches to become PACs. And so I think also I'm hopeful that public opinion plays a role as we go forward and see what the IRS will end up doing.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly see what we can do.
If you are aware of a church, or you attend a church that is endorsing or opposing candidates for office, you can report that to FFRF on our website at the link on the screen.
All right, that wraps up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. You can also check out Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers, including me, discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts. You can also check us out online at we-dissent.org.
Finally, if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us, and we will see you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.